I'd like to welcome you all to our panel, Many Ways of Knowing New York City's Nature. My name is Novem Auyeung. I am a senior scientist with New York City Parks, and I'm also based out of the New York City Urban Field Station that some of you heard a little bit about from our Assistant Commissioner Larson this morning. So it is a partnership between New York City Parks, the USDA Forest Service, and the Natural Areas Conservancy. And we're focused on conducting applied research to help us inform how we care for nature in New York City. And I'll be moderating this panel discussion. So in this session, our panelists will provide an overview of the condition of natural areas in New York City, along with the social and historical context about the people who take care of New York City's natural areas, past, present, and future. They'll also talk about the different methodologies and approaches they've used to collect this information. And as you have seen, much of New York City's early work focused on biophysical research and knowledge about our natural areas, like our flora and faunal composition, across different habitat types, tree canopy cover, persistence of some really fun, rare species in some of the busiest places in New York City, like dusky salamanders in Manhattan, or piping plovers at Rockaway Beach. And that information has been really valuable for informing our protection, restoration, and management work. But there's also a long history and lineage of social, cultural, spiritual, artistic, and other ways of knowing about and caring for nature. And this broader body of knowledge and research is something that we at New York City Parks and our partners are working on integrating more into our work and decision-making as we think about the next 40 years and beyond of caring for nature in one of the densest and most diverse cities in the world. So each panelist is going to have 7 minutes to introduce themselves and their work, and after that, I'll start with a Q&A. I'll kick off the Q&A with some questions, and then the remaining half hour or so will be for you all, for the audience. We have 2 wonderful auditorium staff that will be with microphones so people can raise their hands if they have a question. And to make sure that the Q&A goes smoothly, I just want to go over some ground rules. So first is to be all in, be attentive. If you have phones, please put them in silent or vibrate mode. The second is to respect confidentiality, to remember that people might be sharing their stories and those stories stay, but the lessons learned can leave. It's okay to disagree respectfully. And then finally, hope we all can check our hierarchy and limitations. So really grateful to have lots of people at all stages of life in this conference, from professionals who have been doing this work for decades to people who are students or newcomers who might just be learning that New York City has forests, wetlands, and grasslands. And I want to encourage everybody to be both a teacher and a learner. So I'll do a quick introduction to the speakers now in the order that they'll be speaking, and just please save your questions for the Q&A. So our first speaker will be Jack Chen, Professor of Public History and Humanities and the Director of the Price Institute on Ethnicity, Cultures, and the Modern Experience at Rutgers University. He's also the co-founder of the Public History Project. Next will be Mike Treglia, lead scientist and the the Nature Conservancy's New York City's program. Sorry, Mike. And then we'll hear from Erica Svensson, social scientist with the USDA Forest Service, and my colleague at the New York City Urban Field Station. Next will be Jose Ramirez Garofalo, PhD candidate at Rutgers University, the Director of Science and Research Development at Fresh Kills Park Alliance, and the President of Protector of Pine Oak Woods. And to wrap things up, we'll be hearing from Kelly O'Donnell, Director of Science Forward at Macaulay Honors College. And so now I'll turn the mic over to Jack Chen.
Hello, everybody. Is this okay? You can hear me, Eric? Great. And I hear there's someone giving me a 2-minute warning. Okay, great. Thank you. I'm used to just talking, and as a historian, there's a lot to talk about. I guess I would say that I had spent 22 years at NYU really unpacking the cultural history of New York City. And one of my great pleasures was just to take the class and walk around the city and unpack the built environment as we were walking around. And then I had this opportunity to get a fantastic job at Rutgers at Newark. And I have to say that looking at the history of the region outside of Manhattan is actually quite important. I don't know if you feel that way. You're commuting back and forth between here and Rutgers, right? And so it gave me an insight where I extended my understanding of Manhattan, of especially peoples who have been really marginalized the most by the history of the city. My focus had been on Chinatown and the fact that most people don't know that there is such a thing as the Chinese exclusion laws, and that Chinatown didn't emerge just somehow naturally because Chinese are clannish or whatever, but that there is a history of how spatial relationships developed and emerged, and it had to do with wealth and power, right? So I was doing that in Manhattan, but going across the river, right, across multiple rivers into Newark, and then thinking about the northern New Jersey region totally transformed my understanding of relationships, spatial relationships in the area. So I'm just going to talk about that a little bit, but there's a lot more that I'm sure a lot of you have insights about this that we can talk about. So the first thing I want to say is that the Public History Project, which is formed out of the New York City Mayor's Commission on Monuments that I served on, gave me the insight that so much of the history of the city is actually not known. It's actually not documented. So how could we make a judgment about whether Christopher Columbus's statue should stay or not? Whether Marion Sims' statue could stay or not, and lots of other questions. Because the history of colonization actually is not really known to those of us who have lived in the city, taught in the city. And I got my PhD in the city, and I actually, quite frankly, didn't know much about indigenous peoples, for example, right? So for me, as we're now approaching the Dutch commemoration celebration of their so-called purchase of Manhattan, it's really important for us to, I think, begin to flip the script of the assumptions that we built up around human history, but also the natural environment in these 400 years. And they're talking about the future 400, which is a good challenge for us to have. How do we begin to flip that script in a way that doesn't talk about, for example, pollution that begins with industrialization? So the larger and deeper analysis is really what happens immediately as humans begin to occupy the region, but then also colonial humans begin to change the relationship to the land of one of ownership of property, for example, right? So how can we imagine the Meadowlands, which most of you probably know as this kind of vast, watery area that is actually kind of a no person's land, and in fact, fish, because there's no oxygen in that water, there hadn't been for the longest time, a place that even other than human, more than human creatures could not live and survive. And then also how that had been the site, especially early in the history of New York, a major dumping site. So we can talk about the human waste, but we should also talk about Penn Station. Penn Station, when it was being dismantled, was dumped in the Meadowlands, right? So this idea of where you dump things, kind of really watery areas, wetlands, as a place for that, in fact, the British didn't like. They filled in lots of the peat bogs and areas that are documented well in England itself, right? But how did they bring those attitudes to this area that were in direct confrontation and contestation with indigenous spaces? Oh, I only have 2 minutes already. Okay, so, my God. Okay, so you can see what I mean by this. So I really just am saying that we have to flip the script. And that, for example, the Meadowlands used to be a white cedar forest. And occasionally, if you go through New Jersey, you see the Plank Road signs, which is referring to that. But now we have no memory of that. So what was the earlier relationship with the land that we actually need to deal with and reckon with? Because it's really not just industrialization and the industrial pollution. There's a more fundamental question that we have to begin to address. So I'll just end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jack.
Hey everybody, thanks so much for having me. Thanks, Novem, for organizing this panel. It's so great to be here with these awesome co-panelists. So I grew up really taking what we think of as nature in New York City for granted. I grew up across the street from Clove Lakes Park in Staten Island. My childhood, afternoons in high school were like going out looking for salamanders, totally normal high school thing to do, and finding, decay snakes in friends' backyards and stuff. And, this is like a pretty, busy, more urban, suburban area. And, that really inspired where I went, and have gone in my career for applied conservation research. I was went to grad school to do conservation of herps, reptiles and amphibians. And as I progressed through my graduate career, really started thinking much more broadly about systems, right? Like watersheds, cities, thinking about both people and all different aspects of the environment. And to do that required not just looking at individual organisms and individual species, but looking at landscape scale data. And so that's really an approach that I take these days. I've been with the Nature Conservancy since 2016 with our cities team in New York, and have really been thinking about different forms of open space and green space in New York City. Our work has included looking at the distribution of green roofs in New York City and using best available data to look at tree canopy and see how it's changing through time. And some of our key findings through time have been that a lot of these resources are inequitably distributed. That's not something that's unknown at all, right? I think people experience that on a day-to-day. You can be literally one block from a different area and have completely different tree canopy, different shading, different temperatures that you experience, right? So it's really encouraging that we have over 20% of our landscape is covered by tree canopy as of 2017, and it's been increasing. And it is still really inequitably distributed, and a lot of those inequities are driven by historic factors such as redlining and other discriminatory zone practices and zoning decisions and such. One thing that's really encouraging is some of the more recent changes in tree canopy have been greater. The increases have been greater in some of the areas with less, right? So areas like the South Bronx, for example, have seen some of the greatest increases, but still have by far, among the lowest proportions of tree canopy throughout the city. Something that we think about is what are the benefits of nature in all the different forms, right? And something that I think is really important to hold on to with thinking about benefits is that it's always context specific, right? I think there are really awesome tools out there that help us estimate, in general, what are benefits of tree canopy or green roofs, right? But, the cooling benefits of trees or other vegetation depends on what is the context, what is, the built environment like around the trees, what is the building structure like, is the tree actually shading a building and helping keep that building cooler and reducing energy costs, right? The benefits even transfer to people's lived experience, right? People often have, negative perceptions about trees or other forms of nature, based on legitimate concerns and experiences. And I think, it's really important to be thinking about how we meet people where they're at as we think about, the different forms of open space and green space in a place like New York City, where we're inherently entwined. I almost somewhat intentionally don't use the word nature much because I think, people really are part of nature in a place like New York City, right? Especially, if you think back to pre-colonization, right? And so now we are having so many different people from so many different parts of the world experience, what's native, what's not native, and it really, I think, has different meaning. One of the benefits that we think a lot about, I think, broadly in the city, probably not just me, but many folks in this room, is the cooling benefits of nature, right? And there's been really great research out there by the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene showing that you need to have about 32% vegetation cover within 200 meters of a point. Right, so that's about 7 baseball fields in area. And so that map that's up here on the right kind of illustrates that density. Anything that's green has at least 32% vegetation cover within that 200-meter radius around it. And so many of those areas that have that threshold or are well above it are those forever wild areas, especially you know, in the thicks of Staten Island or Queens or the northern Bronx, right? And I think it's really important to think about what are the benefits that are, you know, uniquely available because of some context of how places are managed, right? So natural areas are managed specifically for biodiversity and ecological function, right? And, you know, by virtue of those things, I think have an easy ability to maintain a certain level of vegetation density and provide those cooling benefits, among many others, right? So I think as we think going forward with natural areas and forever wild spaces, you know, how can we expand these benefits in ways that both maximize, you know, the benefits for people and biodiversity, meeting people where they're at, both on the tangibles and the intangibles. And, you know, so much of this work I just want to name is, you know, we were talking about the many ways of knowing in this panel. You know, I've done a lot of work based on data and literature, you know, review, but so much work is really sourced from, you know, formal and informal knowledge that's out there. So yeah, thanks so much to everyone who's out there doing, you know, data collection and management and sharing stories.
Thank you so much, Mike. Is this on? Lovely. What an amazing panel. Thank you, Novem. Thank all of you for being here in many ways of knowing. I'm going to share a little bit about myself and my association with the natural areas and Forever Wild, and some of the methods I use. So my name's Erica Svensson, and I'm a research social scientist with the USDA Forest Service, and been with the Forest Service for about 24 years, exactly 24 years actually. But I've been working in public service for 30 plus, including working with New York City Parks in 1997 as director of Green Thumb, the city's community gardening program. So I'm especially proud to share that with you and to be a small part of a team of those who have long been champion urban nature. And much of it in the work we've done has been with people in this room, including Novem, and Mike and others, to help save community gardens, to embrace nature as a way to memorialize and come to terms with tragic events in our city like September 11th, to map hundreds and hundreds of community stewardship groups in New York City and beyond, to plant 1 million trees, and with regard to the natural areas, to study them from the perspective of a social scientist, and to understand their social meaning to us in our communities. So for me, my background, I'm a bit of a mutt. I'm a political scientist, environmental scientist, and I have a degree in urban planning. But I identify as a social ecologist, and that's because I spend most of my time understanding and trying to learn more about the interactions between humans and non-human nature. I'm very interested in how these interactions can help sustain us in a positive way, bring us joy, help us become more empathetic to the human and non-human world, and help us mark our own moment in history, if you will, and help us adapt to change. But I have to admit that when I first came to work with Novem and others at the Urban Field Station, I had this perspective as you know, from the streets, you know, community gardens, street trees, green streets, greenways, green roofs, natural areas. What's so natural about them? And for me, I've always considered humans as positive agents of change. Oh, I know, it's true, we've screwed things up, you know, as we know from this morning's panel, but I just had this maybe even naive, maybe hopeful kind of understanding by working with communities in New York City, but in many other places who had very little, but were doing very big things. So for me, I really believed in the power of us as human beings to be positive agents of change. You know, in working for the Forest Service, we brought many delegations of people to New York City to tour the natural areas. And I remember one time we had a supervisor from the Tongass National Forest, which is 17 million acres, right? And I thought there'd be a lot of chuckles and laughs when they went to Inwood Park, or when they went to Alley Pond Park, but there weren't. There was just this great connection and understanding with Novem and Tim Wenskis and Jennifer Greenfeld and Fiona Watt, and this great understanding that we're all in the same business. You know, we have a public mission, we have a biocultural mission, we have a democratic mission to create these spaces not just for the wildlife and know that they are very special habitats. But for ourselves as humans, we need these spaces desperately. So that was a big moment for me. But around 2012, we entered into a formal research collaboration, which has really shaped a lot of the learning I've done over the past few years with the Natural Areas Conservancy in New York City Parks, and we conducted a social assessment of the natural areas. You heard this morning, Marit was sharing about the ecological assessment. Well, we did sort of a parallel play social assessment of the 10,000 acres, and we interviewed thousands of New Yorkers visiting them. And, you know, we basically observed, and we talked, and we mapped, and we walked, and we counted. We took our cues from a very small publication that was issued by the Forest Service in 1964 in the Pacific Northwest region. It was the first publication by a social scientist who wasn't an economist in the Forest Service. And it was titled, "A New Look at an Old Friend, Observation as a Technique for Research, for Recreation Research." It was a simple guidebook that then transformed the way that the Forest Service started to understand its natural areas and its wilderness areas as a place of social meaning, as a social space. Very transformative. And in many ways, it made us understand why these places make us feel as beautiful as the birds and bees. This is from Marine Park. I should have noted that earlier. And we documented maybe thousands of ways that what we call the written park, the way people write and communicate and connect with natural areas. And sometimes it's seen as, oh, it's graffiti, or it's trash, or it's a distraction. But when we step back a few paces and really reflect on what is written here, and where it is written, and why, we come to realize how important these spaces really are in our lives. So that little book that was written by Bill Birch, and he was mentioned this morning by Jennifer Greenfeld, who went on to teach at the forestry school at Yale for decades, he used an observation that we adapted here in New York City. We kind of ripped him off a little bit, and that focused on observations, counts, and interviews to create entirely new social assessment maps for our natural areas. And we wouldn't walk through natural areas. We wouldn't stand at a fixed point. We would walk through the entirety of these natural areas, much like Birch did in the Pacific Northwest. We would speak to people, and we would listen and try and hear their stories. This idea of restoring or storing these landscapes, it was really important. You know, the plants and the animals, they talk to us in different ways, right? But people, we can say, why are you here? What are you doing here today? Why is this place important to you? So to make a long story short, nearly 50 years later, it was our honor to work together in this collaboration of assessing the natural areas from a social-cultural perspective. I learned a great deal. And, you know, always I count on understanding what people are doing as opposed to what they say they're going to do. So, you know, when you have the opportunity to be in a natural area, it is a refuge, it is a place of peace, it is a place of competition and collaboration, but it's also a place of people, and it's just important to just remember that.
Thank you so much, Erica.
Hello, my name is Jose Ramirez Garofolo. I'm an ecologist. I wear a bunch of different hats, but today I come to you as an ecologist from Staten Island, much like Mike. I heard that in the crowd. That was great. Thank you. So you'll see the slide behind me has a bunch of different things on it, but I'm going to take you actually from all the way on my left. On your right, there is the logo for Protectors of Pine Oak Woods, an organization that was founded 49 years ago. It'll be 50 years in 3 months. So almost 50 years ago, a group of Staten Islanders came together to advocate for the protection of what is now known as Clay Pit Pond Park State Preserve. Fast forward 50 years later, my good friend and colleague Cliff Hagan passed on the role of president to me, and I had to take on 50 years of advocacy and really grassroots campaigning for natural areas on Staten Island and New York City as a whole. And so when I first came into the role in February, I had to do a lot of thinking. Why am I so interested in protecting natural areas on Staten Island? And it was the same question that I asked myself when I was a math and physics major in undergrad, and I said, I don't really think I want to keep doing physics. I think I want to be outside a little more. And so the question that I asked myself was, why do I want to keep doing this? Why am I so interested and so invested in protecting natural areas? And I realized living on Staten Island on the North Shore, where it's more of a built environment, made me appreciate the natural spaces throughout the island and throughout New York City a lot more, I think, than many of the people that I grew up around that lived on the South Shore and maybe didn't really understand the importance of those natural areas to their own mental health because they were always existing within that space. And so it made me think, okay, well, what are some of the things that we gain from natural areas and living in natural areas? And if we move a little bit to the right, we see the comparative flora of Staten Island, 1879 to 1981. In 1879, we had what I would say is the peak of the natural history boom in our region. And natural history is really the basis of all of the ecological knowledge that we have. And I tell this to my students, I tell this to my friends, I tell this to my colleagues. If you're not looking at the species that are around you, instead of looking at the computer and the R prompt that you're working on and the code that you're working on, you're really not interacting with the natural world in a way that is conducive to making sure that we're preserving what we have and the biodiversity that we're all fighting for. So 1879, these two guys, Richard Bugler and Stephen Parisio, were not alive at that point. Instead, they were naturalists like William T. Davis, who were really what I would think of as formative figures in our local and actually really our regional natural history, as well as Nathaniel Britton, who is a Staten Islander and founded the institution that we're all at right now, the New York Botanical Garden. And so these people on Staten Island weren't as, well, most of them, aside from Nathaniel Britton, weren't really educated. They went to high school and maybe that was it, or maybe they dropped out of middle school, and they just went out into the natural world and they cataloged everything that they saw. And so they were naturalists at heart. And so I like to think about my own role now, if we move a little to the right again, the butterflies of Staten Island. This is something that I worked on with my colleagues and something that a lot of us are still working on and thinking about the ecological associations between arthropods and birds and other species in our natural areas in Staten Island and New York City as a whole. And then since we are on the Many Ways of Knowing panel, I want to plug this figure that we see all the way to the right. This is an American bird grasshopper. And if you're from the Southeast or you're from the Southwest, you've probably seen one of these. If you're from New York, you probably haven't, except if you've been to Fresh Kills Park in the last 5 years, where we now have a really large population of them. And so, aside from just the natural history component of what we all do, there is a component of documenting change in the Anthropocene. And so, one of the indications that we across ecology and across all biological sciences, one of the indicators, I should say, of global change is the redistribution of species that we're seeing across the globe. And so the American bird grasshopper is a southern species that is now taking refuge in New York. And so some of these species that we're seeing occurring in our area are pest species, but a lot of them are what we would call native species that are shifting their range. And the natural areas in New York City and our region as a whole are now refuges for these species that are coming into our areas. And they're all species that we're going to have to, at some point, live with, whether that is negative, whether that's positive. But I hope my take-home message to everyone is to please, when you are thinking about the ways that we know the health of our natural systems start at the very base of what is sometimes a really high-dimensional problem, and that's understanding the natural history of our region.
Thank you so much, Jose. Kelly.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly O'Donnell. I am the Director of Science Forward at Macaulay Honors College, which is part of CUNY, the City University of New York. And what I'm going to talk about is how we use participatory science, sometimes called community science, formerly called citizen science, for a couple of things. My program is our science curriculum, and so we use participatory science for a lot of reasons, but one of them is to demonstrate that science is for everybody, even though historically it might not have been. But we also, the projects that we use in our curriculum and in the City Nature Challenge, which I'm going to talk about, are ones that connect our students and the public to the nature of the city. So my background is in plant evolutionary ecology. I studied invasive plants that like to thrive in this habitat. Most of what I do now is science pedagogy, and so I direct our curriculum, which is a skills-focused interdisciplinary science curriculum. It's called Science Forward, and we use iNaturalist as our sort of community science application of choice to collect data for this course. So we have 500 sophomores every year who do a BioBlitz. Our BioBlitz was just last weekend, so I'm still feeling the effects of it. We were up in Van Cortlandt Park. We use, if you've not done a BioBlitz before, it's a temporally and spatially limited species diversity survey, usually done by the public. In our case, it's done by our 500 students. They come for like a 3-hour shift. We put them on teams with local naturalists, and they are set to find as many things as possible. We document those on iNaturalist and on paper. And so iNaturalist, if you're not already on it, although I'm sure many people are, is an application that you can use to document your nature observations wherever you are. They get geotagged and time-stamped, and then there's a community of iNaturalist users that will help you identify whatever it is you're looking at. So you get to learn all of these things. You might not know that there are all these different kinds of grasshoppers or trees or whatever, and the community helps you know that there are different ones and know that those are around you. And so at our BioBlitz, we do this in order for our students to have a data set to use to practice the data science and scientific literacy skills that are learning outcomes of our course. So they'll collect their data sets, they'll use them in class somehow, and then what we do, and so this is in the fall. In the spring, we turn that experience we use that experience to host, or I'm the lead organizer of the City Nature Challenge for New York City. So the New York City arm of the City Nature Challenge, every city has an organizer, and what we do with that is we get a lot of partner organizations together who will help us get the public out making nature observations over a 4-day weekend. So a City Nature Challenge is essentially a 4-day BioBlitz of the entire city that everyone can participate in. And so we've been doing this, we've done 8 of these City Nature Challenges so far. We've done 12 BioBlitzes at Macaulay. I've been at Macaulay for 11 years. And the City Nature Challenge is entirely done with iNaturalist, so it is entirely, all the data are collected there. We can, from that figure up there, since the City Nature Challenge started, it has been the peak week of observations every year that it has happened, even the first one in 2016 when it was just 2 cities. So there's this peak of activity in the end of April, and then the peak goes away and it flattens out. But each year that plateau is a little bit higher, and so we're hoping that people stay on iNaturalist and continue to make nature observations from wherever it is they are. And so I have to get my numbers here. So the goals of the City Nature Challenge are all about building connections, so connecting people to their urban habitat, connecting people to also the stewardship organizations that take care of that urban habitat. So we'll have all of these partner organizations come together. They put on free events for the public, and a lot of times people don't realize that there are all these organizations there, but these organizations are the hosts of these events, and people come to them and they can make nature observations there. Similarly to, I forgot to mention this before, but when we do the BioBlitz with our students, often the students have never been to the park where we are doing the BioBlitz. So this year we're in Van Cortlandt Park, and 83% of them, because we surveyed them at the beginning, had never been to Van Cortlandt Park before. It's the third largest park in the city, and they had never been there. And so we're using these opportunities to demonstrate that these spaces are for everyone. You belong in these spaces, and you can make these connections in these spaces. You can use the city as a laboratory to connect or to collect data from and like ask ecological questions that, you know, sometimes when our students are first starting out, they're like, this is not an area where you can do science here, but you can. You can learn about ecology in the city. And so for the City Nature Challenge, we're building these connections between people, between these community organizations, and then we're also, because we're doing this on iNaturalist, connecting the people who make the observations to a larger group of global community scientists who are also contributing these observations. They're helping make identifications. And so those are the big goals of the City Nature Challenge. So this year, we had globally, we had 690 cities participating over 51 countries. We made 2.4 million observations of, these are the numbers I had to write down, 2.4 million observations of 65,000 species, and we had 83,000 people involved across the globe. In New York this year, we had 1,000 people, almost 1,000 people make observations in the city of 25,000 observations. We had 400 new users. So this bar graph here is all of the New York City Nature Challenges. And so now the number is over 1,000. When the results get pulled, like the week later, it was like 990 something. Now it's over 1,000. But over the 8 years that we've done this, we've had 4,000 people contribute observations. It's over 130,000 observations on iNaturalist. And every year we do add new species to the iNaturalist database that have never been observed in New York City before. And so just to sort of wrap up here, what we're hoping that, the reason we use this, you know, as part of our curriculum, but as also part of, you know, this sort of public outreach piece, is that we want people to be more bioliterate. We want them to be more aware of the species that are living with us in the city. So getting to know those species better by knowing what they are called and knowing how maybe they're related to each other by making these observations. We're also getting people to engage in biodiscovery, which is, you know, documenting these new species or these new species interactions in places we hadn't documented them before. We've done our BioBlitz at Fresh Kills, North Mound. We have a whole lichen list that came out of there. I don't think we observed that grasshopper then. It was a while ago. But getting these species lists for these new places is really, you know, important to have those baseline data. And, you know, also for us at Macaulay, we're using these data to practice scientific and data literacy skills. iNaturalist is a great flexible tool for all of that, but it's not the only one. There's tons of community science projects out there that people can participate in, like Budburst. NASA Globe has tons of different, like there's cloud observers, there's other ones with tree canopy, I think. And so I would encourage you to, you know, go to, like SciStarter has a good library of these things, or you go to iNaturalist, or just look up these citizen science, or these community science projects and get involved in them and see how you can use them and how you can bring, you know, your friends, your family to use these projects to get to know nature better.
Thank you so much. All right. So thank you so much to the panelists for great introductions. And I'm just gonna kick us off with the Q&A with some kind of questions to start. So I think a lot of you talked about the importance of local context and local knowledge. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see sort of like your kind of like research and work informing the way we care for natural areas in New York City, or even tell the story of natural areas in the city kind of moving forward in the next you know, decades and beyond. So anybody would like to go?
I mean, I can start. I never feel more connected to New York City than I do during the City Nature Challenge. When I am outside in these parks, I was telling Novem this earlier, like I try to make it a point to see a new place in the city that I've never seen before. And so that has helped, you know, when we are making new events for the City Nature Challenge and bringing the students out. The community science data that we get also shows where there are these like observation deserts, aren't I naturalist anyway?
Oh, yeah.
Like, you know, why aren't people making observations there? I mean, sometimes it's obvious, like, oh, that's Kennedy Airport, but like, but there are other places where we know there are people, but there are not observations being made. So those are opportunities to go to those places and get more people out and build that awareness of the natural, like, urban nature, natural habitat.
Very cool. Anybody want to try?
I can tell one story about some of my team's work. So I talked a lot about, you know, the work that I more specifically do, but my team at the Nature Conservancy, we convene a coalition, Forest for All New York City, that now has over 150 member organizations from across the city with lots of different perspectives. And you know, historically, there's been so much great work around the urban forest, all 7+ million trees, and you know, the people who care for them, research them, and so forth. But there has not been a single holistic voice or, you know, way to really activate people around this resource. And you know, with this coalition, something that's been really exciting to see is, you know, the different perspectives from different local community-based organizations, even environmental justice organizations, and you know, diversity of even real estate groups, as well as city agencies. You know, getting the different perspectives that they have in the mix for things like citywide advocacy and policy. You know, as one element, right? Because I think often like big messages are really driven by, you know, single entities, right? So how can we get, you know, a broader variety of voices in the room to, you know, advocate effectively for what is needed, not just citywide, but even in more local places, while being, you know, consistent with a holistic voice. And then the other part, you know, I think another exciting thing about this coalition is it organizes a day every year. This year will be the third event, City of Forest Day, which is October 26th coming up. And basically organizations from across the city, whether or not they're members of the coalition or not, can host an event of any sort, you know, related to trees and the urban forest, right? So there can be natural areas stewardship projects that I know, you know, New York City Parks puts on a lot of events related to this day, but even, you know, poetry, storytelling, art, you know, all sorts of events can be part of it. And so it's a way to get, you know, different communities' perspectives and voices out into the space where, you know, I think they're often not embraced as readily or easily. So that's just a, you know, different side of my team's work that I think is a cool way to think about, you know, different ways of knowing.
Any other?
So part of the dilemma of being a historian, and what I appreciate about what you all are talking about in terms of citizen science and urban forests and just kind of appreciating what's here, is that I'm very aware of what has been disappeared. So I'm constantly playing with that tug on me, so I'm very much feeling as a historian a sense of profound loss in terms of what had been here. So maybe oysters is a way to talk about this. I go back and forth between Maine a great deal, and in Maine I've been able to get access to some of the oysters that were referred to by some of the early colonists who were saying, well, there were 18-inch oysters here, right? So I'm sorry I didn't bring one, but I actually have very large oyster shells. And this sense of loss of oysters is not just for that individual oyster and that size of that oyster, but in being in New Jersey, I've been learning about really Liberty State Park. Now, Liberty State Park was built on 7 square miles of oyster banks. And that was actually all covered over by the railroad ash and waste that was then poured over it. So there's a longer history of what a keystone species is about. And I guess I'm feeling that that sense of loss and possibility is perhaps a good tension for us to be working with, because to deny and ignore the loss is also dangerous, right? But to just dwell on that loss is also dangerous. But I guess I would just say quickly that part of the dilemma that I have as a historian is that I know that so much of what we're grappling with are systems of thought and systems of attitudes about nature itself. And the colonization effort to begin with was really an effort to colonize nature and commodify nature and turn them into tradable goods and things that could be profited from in global trade. So much of the history of our region and the very rapid kind of decimation of whole forests and whole areas of our region is because of what was happening before 1776 and carried on after 1776. So the one example would be, of course, oysters, but also really how the forests were decimated. So I'll just note that Per Kalm, who was a student of Linnaeus, was already moving around from Philadelphia to New Jersey and to Albany, walking and noticing and being present about what species and what was being disappeared in 1750, right? And he's really dramatically noticing the forests that were already being decimated in New Jersey, for example, in where I work, right? So I just kind of want to play with that kind of tension that's unresolved, but also hopefully that can be a basis in which, in terms of the citizen science we do and the kind of work in Staten Island, where a lot of that nature is still evident, and the question of invasive species, which you're bringing up so importantly, that's also linked to immigration and the fear of, of the border anxiety that we're experiencing now, is so critical. And how do we surface all that as ongoing themes that we're dealing with today?
Yeah. That's just to build on that, those beautiful remarks. From my perspective, walking through the natural areas in this city and in other places as well, large and small, and talking to people, I'm more and more convinced that these spaces are very special and that they have this enormous role in our lives and in our society to help us process change, to deal with loss, but also to chart a course for the future. And when you think about Teddy Roosevelt and you think about the National Park Service and the U.S. Forest Service in the turn of the last century, when there was all this talk about the great promise of American democracy, it's no different than the places that we have these natural areas in New York City. We have to see these spaces similarly because they are very special. They're free, for one. You can walk into them still. Amazing. And when we did our surveys, Novem, you joined us, when we asked people, where else do you go in New York City for recreation and for nature enjoyment? And I forget the exact number. It was well over 60%.
It's actually, I know we get asked this question a lot. I think like a quarter of the people said that they go nowhere else.
They go nowhere else.
Yeah. So
They go nowhere else.
This is their
So this is really important to think about and reflect on. They go nowhere else. And then, you press and you talk to other people and you say, well, I go to Jones Beach or I go to Orchard Beach, but it's a very small constellation of places that people go through whatever mode of transport they have or leisure time or resources. And it's really important. We should think about that these spaces are carrying a lot. It's a heavy lift. And when you step into a natural area, it is very different than being on a ball field or in a garden, or walking down a street. And and I think this idea about helping us process change, because you observe all around you this dynamic ecosystem, right? And recently I've been doing some interviews with superintendents of the National Park Service around climate change and how they're dealing with it. And I've gotten these profound responses that kind of go into three categories. One is, we're beyond climate change. This area is not coming back. I'm dealing with beyond, climate change. Some people are preparing for it. They've got all these models and ideas that they know it's coming. And others are just in the middle of it right now, like at Yosemite. And then there's this understanding, not to want to give up, but to say these spaces are so powerful and abiding because they're these profound, important habitats, but they're also places for us to actually improve ourselves and our society, and to reflect back about what was lost, but what can be gained, and to do that kind of mediation. So please know that we have our own Yosemites here. We have our own Muir Woods. We have our own Tongass National Forests here in New York City, and they are very special.
Thank you so much. Let's see. Oh, good. I still have one more time for one more question, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. I think we sort of alluded to this. So even though the focus of this conference is on like New York City parks, natural areas specifically, these areas don't exist in isolation, and they're connected to other places. I think we've already talked about New Jersey. So what are some of the ways that your work has illustrated the importance of this, considering New York City's natural areas when trying to address these broader kind of systemic issues that cross boundaries like human health, environmental justice, and all of those things? So it's a big question.
That is a big question.
I know. Yeah.
So I think a lot about landfills because I do work at Fresh Kills Park, and obviously if you go back 23 years now when we officially closed, we were the largest landfill in the world. One of the interesting things about our region is we have a lot of landfills, and a lot of them are closing. And not only is there the human physical health aspect of it, but the mental health aspect of closing landfills and turning them into parks is something that I think about a lot. Not only are they good parks, but they're really good for biodiversity. If you can plant native warm season grass mix, just plug in that, anybody that's working on any landfills, you are restoring, or I shouldn't say restoring, you're creating a habitat that has been gone from the northeastern United States for now hundreds of years in an appreciable percentage. We are way less than 1% remaining temperate grassland in eastern North America. And so when I talk to people about Fresh Kills, when I talk to people about Shirley Chisholm State Park, when I talk to people about the landfill that they see on their commute into Rutgers every day, which honestly I don't even remember what it's called, but it's a big open landfill, I say, hey, you know, we should think about this as an opportunity for biodiversity conservation. So that's my little, my little plug.
Yeah, I know. Great to plug Fresh Kills. Oh, Erica?
Because, you know, I could talk forever.
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah.
Well, because you're asking some big questions, like how
I know,
this work
right?
here is related to, I'm going to pick human health and well-being. I'm going to tell two quick stories. One is from the social assessment I've been talking about that we did in collaboration with New York City Parks and the Natural Areas Conservancy. So we were in Marine Park, surveying that area, walking through Marine Park, doing our interviews, mapping what we saw as observations. And then we're doing our interviews, and we talked to a gentleman. We said, well, one of the questions on the quick survey is, what are you doing here in the park today? Duh. And he says, sort of to us, like, I'm just here in the park. And I said, well, you know, what are you really doing? He says, well, I come here every morning, and I just look at these trees. And it was at the edge of one of the natural areas. And it kind of sets me on my day, gets me ready for my day. I'm a New York City bus driver, and I get stressed out, really stressed out. But I come here, you know, take a minute, drink my coffee, look at these trees, and I feel ready. I don't even know if we need any more evidence than that to understand how these places are playing a role at the individual level, right? But also how being a bus driver in New York City and having your wits about you is really kind of impacts many of us as well. The other story I'll tell is just years ago, and I'm going to forget the date, we did, I don't know if any of you remember or were part of, some of you may have been authors of Restorative Commons. It was an edited volume we did years ago with a lot of folks from New York City Parks to tell stories about our common landscapes. And we had Oliver Sacks. We did a workshop at the New York Academy of Medicine, and Oliver Sacks, the neuroscientist, I don't know who got him involved, but we started talking with him, and he actually wrote a foreword for that. It's a Forest Service publication, free, still available. And he wrote a foreword, but when he was talking to us, he said, you know, in all my years, I just really wish that I had done a little bit more work with forests and natural areas. And I actually think this is so important. I wrote down a little bit what he said. He said, you know, I had this experience where patients that couldn't find their way to open the doorknob to open, you know, get out of the room or even unlatch the garden gate. When we would walk into the woods, they found their way around them. They were able to navigate up a trail or through a path. You know, and he's like, that's always stuck with me. I think the idea was there were clear signs of an ability to navigate their own way. Once again, I mean, there's other folks smarter than me that study this kind of work, obviously, but I think we all should take heart when we think about how these spaces are so important from a multitude of ways, but really profound in terms of our own human health and well-being.
Oh, is this 1 minute left from the entire? Oh, okay, before we open up. So I guess, did anybody want to respond before I open it up to the audience for their questions?
I'll just add one more thing. You know, as a landscape ecologist and somebody who thinks, you know, really from a systems perspective, and you know, a lot of us do here, you know, I think we can really think about natural areas as one part of what we call a mosaic of the city, right? The mosaic includes the roads, the buildings, you know, all, you know, everything we can see from a top-down or ground level perspective, right? So natural areas, of course, are really managed in specific ways for specific reasons, right? And those reasons might not meet everybody where they're at, right? So I think it's really important to think about what do people want? What do people need? You know, culturally, mentally, in lots of different ways, and think about natural areas as just one part of the mosaic of the city, right? How can we use, you know, the diversity, the really huge diversity of street tree species that can be used to meet people where they are, or, you know, different forms of green roofs, you know, food production, or just a place for respite and art inspiration, right? So I think natural areas are such an important part of the city, and, you know, everywhere if we think about nature more broadly, right? And we need to think about, you know, everything else that is, you know, nature that we so actively manage in a space like New York City to help meet, you know, people where they are, getting what they're wanting and needing.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Do we have any audience members who would like to ask questions of the panelists? Oh, I think Galen, or oh yeah, sure. I think there's somebody out here in near the front, the third row.
Hi, thanks. I'm Dan Tana with the Urban Park Rangers, and our job is to connect. So it actually goes to what you were just saying. Our job is to connect New Yorkers to their parks and the environments around them. So you all touched a little bit on meeting people where they are, to turn what the research and that you've done. So can you expand on ways to take the research that you've done and turn it back to get people more involved in stewardship of these natural areas?
I do. So I do run one of those organizations. So, you know, and once again, I'm going to bring it back to the landfill and now actually talk about the public health part. My research shows that it's safe to be in natural areas. A lot of people have always looked at a lot of the public lands, especially on Staten Island, as a blight on their borough. And even when you see a bunch of trees, they're remembering their grandparents telling them how dirty and disgusting it was in the 60s and 70s, and you know, the resurgence of biodiversity over the last 15 years really helps me show people that it's safe to come out into nature in an appreciable way and not just in passing.
You know, part of what you're bringing up is this whole question of safety, clean, dirty, and there's so much embedded in the culture, the dominant culture of what's dirty. Yep. So in urban areas especially, where, like, you know, the streets are dirty, the rats are out there, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, I live in Brooklyn, there are rats on our streets, so I'm not denying that, you know. But these systems of how we think, and therefore what we do with waste and dumping, and the consumption that we have. So once we buy something shiny and new, we consume it, then it's dirty. and we throw it out, right? So these fundamental systems of thinking and classification are part of the challenge that we're grappling with. So I kind of appreciate all of what you're saying in that context as well. So.
I think one thing I'll just add too is, the idea of finding what are the intersecting areas of interest, right? And this is something I think about from an organizational perspective with the coalition we convene, right? Where, organizationally, there are a lot of groups that are part of Forest for All New York City that aren't tree or urban forestry specific groups, right? But have, maybe an interest in public health or something along those lines. And I think, I would put out the question of like, in a given area where you're often doing programming, are there kind of cultural values or perspectives that you could tap into to identify like, oh, maybe there is a specific need that folks want and can actually, that need could be met, by the natural areas in a way, right? Of course, not extractive needs, but, how do are people wanting to get out and exercise? How can they use exercise in a different way in natural areas, for example?
And maybe I'll add something as well. Just to appreciate that there's a whole body of research out there about how you do good community engagement, how you establish functional, like, interdisciplinary teams, how you co-produce knowledge together, that I think we're trying to explore in the New York City Urban Field Station. So we recently got a grant, Parks actually got a grant to establish a paid internship, apprenticeship program, and I think I saw some folks representing some new members of that team. And so we are really working on making sure people in New York City are aware that caring for nature is actually a job, a profession that you can have. We're trying to shift it so that it's not always reliant, we're not always reliant, unfortunately, on unpaid internships, that a lot of these positions are paid, that they, can help, you can make a living, doing all of this wonderful work. So it's one way too.
Can I just add quick?
Sure.
The Urban Park Rangers do fantastic programming.
Yes, exactly.
So I just want to thank you all for that during all year, but during the City Nature Challenge too. I've been to those events and there's families and they're observing nature together, and it's very good thing that you all are providing for the community.
Exactly, yeah.
Can I just second, third that?
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like, even in the Forest Service, the rangers, the public affairs officers, the folks that, and this is slow to come to the Forest Service to have partnership coordinators and stuff. These are not titles, but I would say, that we normally had, but they are, that's what's going to bring our agency into the future. And I see it here in New York City as well, like communicating with the public of any age, giving people a chance to, and I keep using this term, like, to story or restory their place and become embedded in their place. The idea about, and this comes from research, that you want to have hope and that things are possible. You want to know what kind of and be part of something bigger than yourself. But a lot of folks, won't do anything because they either feel like, okay, Jack's got it. He's going to take care of everything, so I can just sit back and do anything. Or they just feel it's too overwhelming. It's a landfill. What can I possibly do? So it's this kind of balance between giving people enough reason to do something, but that they can do it their own way. I mean, as human beings, we like to create things, and that creation comes in all different forms. And we like to leave a legacy of change and inspiration. We don't always walk around being shamed and guilted and feeling bad or trying to make money. I mean, those are all things we do. But in the end, what sustains us is the love, right, and the connection to each other and to place. So I feel like the Rangers, sorry to put it all on your question, I feel like you guys are at that intersection of a great opportunity to do that work. And sometimes you'll never see it, but know that it works. And, I've interviewed people who, when I've asked, why are you joining the Pine Woods, or why are you doing this work? And they'll say, well, 20 years ago, I was in the park and I did this program, or 30 years ago, my grandmother told me how to do this. So we take these these experiences with us because they touch us in a very profound way. So